in the dust-choked frontier town of Millbrook, Kansas, 1883. A debt auction was about to change 4 lives forever. Wyatt Cole stood among the desperate crowd, watching as families were torn apart and possessions scattered to the highest bidder. He had come for supplies, not salvation, but when he saw Mabel Stover and her twin daughters on that makeshift platform, something stirred in his weathered heart. The auctioneer's voice cut through the morning air like a whip, calling for bids. On a woman who could barely stand, and 2 frightened girls clutching her skirts. What would possess a broken-down cowboy to spend his last $40 on strangers? Wyatt Cole had been riding hard for 3 days when the spire of Millbrook's only church came into view through the Kansas heat shimmer. His horse, a sturdy bay mare named Juniper, picked her way carefully down the rutted main street, her hooves raising small clouds of dust that seemed to hang in the still air like memories of better times. The town stretched before them like a collection of weathered bones bleached by too many seasons of unforgiving sun and bitter wind. The saddle beneath him creaked with every step, its leather worn smooth by countless miles, and shaped by the weight of a man who had learned to carry his burdens alone. It was a good saddle once, hand-tooled by a craftsman in Dodge City, back when Wyatt still believed in fresh starts and second chances. Now it bore the scars of his wandering knife cuts from mending tack by firelight, earned marks from too many camps where he dozed too close to the flames, and the deep patina that came from years of honest sweat and honest work. He'd been a different man when he first threw his leg over that saddle. Younger, certainly, but more than that hopeful in a way that now seemed as foreign to him as the genteel manners his mother had tried to teach him back in Missouri. That was before the accusations, before the trial that wasn't really a trial. Before he'd learned that a man's reputation could be destroyed as easily as a house of cards in a prairie wind. The accusations had been false, of course. Wyatt had never stolen cattle, never cheated at cards, never run off with another man's wife. But truth, he'd discovered, was a luxury that small towns couldn't always afford when they needed someone to blame for their troubles. The drought had lasted 3 years. The bank had foreclosed on half the ranches in the county. And when Thomas Garrett's prize bull turned up missing, well, it was easier to point fingers at the stranger than to admit that desperate times made. Honest men do desperate things. So here he was, 34 years old, and carrying everything he owned in his saddlebags, looking for work in yet another town where nobody knew his name or his shame. The worn coins in his pocket, 40 silver dollars that represented the sum total of his worldly wealth, clinked softly with Juniper's gait. It wasn't much, but it was enough to buy supplies and maybe a few nights in a boarding house. Wow. He looked for work. Millbrok was smaller than he'd expected. Maybe 200 souls if you counted the children and the old-timers who spent their days whittling on the porch of Henderson's General Store. The buildings leaned into each other, like old friends sharing secrets, their clapboard siding gray with age and neglect. A few businesses lined the main street: the General Store, a saloon called the Broken Wheel, a blacksmith's shop where the ring of hammer on anvil provided a steady rhythm to the afternoon, and the church whose bell tower served as the town's highest point and unofficial WATCHTOWER. As Wyatt guided Juniper toward the hitching post outside Henderson's, he noticed the crowd gathered in the small square beside the courthouse. It was an unusual sight for a Tuesday afternoon. Men in their work clothes, women clutching shawls despite the heat, children peering between adult legs to get a better view of whatever spectacle had drawn them together. The murmur of voices carried an undercurrent of excitement mixed with something darker, something that made the hair on the back of Wyatt's neck stand up. He'd seen crowds like this before, in other towns, at other times. Sometimes they gathered for celebrations, barn raisings, weddings, the occasional traveling show. But more often, they gathered for the kind of events that brought out both the best and worst in people: public trials, executions, and the grim necessity of debt auctions, where families were torn apart and lives were measured in dollars and cents. A wooden platform had been erected in the center of the square, crude but sturdy, built from planks that still showed the marks of the saw. It reminded Wyatt of a gallows, though he pushed that thought away as soon as it formed. An official-looking man in a black suit stood on the platform, papers in his hand, his voice carrying over the crowd as he read from what appeared to be a legal document. Double quotes ... in accordance with the laws of the territory of Kansas and the provisions of the Homestead Act. The following properties and assets are hereby offered for sale to satisfy the outstanding debts of the late James Stover. The words hit Wyatt like a physical blow. A debt auction. He'd heard about them. Of course, everyone on the frontier had. When a homesteader died with more debts than assets, the territorial government would seize everything: land, livestock, tools, even personal belongings. They'd sell it all to the highest bidder, and if there wasn't enough to cover the debts, well, that was just the price of trying to make a life in a place that didn't much care whether you lived or died. But this was the first time he'd actually witnessed one, and the reality was worse than he'd imagined. The crowd pressed closer as the auctioneer began listing the items for sale: farm equipment, household goods, a few head of cattle. With each item, a piece of someone's life was reduced to its monetary value and handed over to strangers. Wyatt was about to turn away to conduct his business at the general store and put this grim spectacle behind him. When he saw her, she sat on a wooden chair at the edge of the platform, her hands folded in her lap with a dignity that seemed impossible, given the circumstances. Even from a distance, he could see that she was young, maybe 25 or 26, with dark hair pulled back in a simple bun and a face that might have been beautiful, if not for the lines of pain etched around her eyes. Her dress was plain, but clean, mended in several places with careful stitches that spoke of pride maintained despite poverty. But it was the children that made Wyatt's breath catch in his throat. Two little girls, identical twins by the look of them, stood on either side of her chair like small sentinels. They couldn't have been more than 6 years old, with their mother's dark hair and wide, frightened eyes that seemed to take in everything, and understand far more than children should have to understand. Their dresses were as carefully mended as their mother's, and they each clutched a small bundle, probably everything they owned in the world. The woman's legs were covered by a blanket despite the heat, and Wyatt noticed the way she held herself, the careful stillness that spoke of someone who had learned to live with chronic pain. A walking stick leaned against her chair, its wood polished smooth by countless hours of use. Lot number 17, the auctioneer called out, his voice cutting through Wyatt's observations. Mabel Stover, widow of the deceased, along with her twin daughters, Mary and Margaret. Mrs. Stover is skilled in teaching and household management. The children are healthy and well-mannered. Bidding starts at $20. The crowd stirred, and Wyatt felt his stomach turn. He'd heard that such things happened, but seeing it with his own eyes was different. This wasn't property being sold. These were people, a mother and her children, being auctioned off like livestock to pay for debts they probably had no part in creating. $25, called out a voice from the crowd. Wyatt turned to see a heavy-set man in a prosperous-looking coat, his face red from the heat, and something else: anticipation, maybe, or hunger. 30, came another bid, this one from a thin man near the front, who kept glancing at the little girls with an expression that made Wyatt's hands clench into fists. The woman on the platform, Mabel, kept her eyes fixed on some point in the distance, her face a mask of quiet dignity. But Wyatt could see the slight tremor in her hands, the way her daughters pressed closer to her chair as the bidding continued. $35, the heavy-set man called out again, and Wyatt caught the cruel satisfaction in his voice. This wasn't about helping a family in need. This was about acquiring property, human property, at the lowest possible price. The auctioneer raised his gavel. $35. Do I hear 40? The square fell silent, except for the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods and the distant sound of the blacksmith's hammer. Wyatt found himself stepping forward, his hand moving instinctively to the pocket where his 40 silver dollars rested. He'd come to this town looking for work, for a chance to start over in a place where his past couldn't follow him. The last thing he needed was to get involved in someone else's troubles, to take on the responsibility of caring for people he didn't even know. The smart thing, the sensible thing, would be to walk away, to let someone else deal with the ugly realities of frontier justice. But as he looked at those two little girls, at the way they stood so bravely beside their mother, despite their fear, something inside him rebelled against the smart and sensible choice. Maybe it was the memory of his own mother, who had raised him alone after his father died in the war. Maybe it was the knowledge of what it felt like to be at the mercy of strangers, to have your fate decided by people who saw you as nothing more than a problem to be solved, or a commodity to be traded. Or maybe it was something simpler than that, the recognition that some things mattered more than money, more than safety, more than the careful preservation of a life that had already been broken beyond easy repair. 35 going once, the auctioneer called, his voice echoing off the surrounding buildings. The gavel gleamed in his raised hand like a weapon about to fall. Wyatt's throat felt dry as desert sand. His fingers traced the outline of the coins. In his pocket 40 silver dollars that represented not just his immediate survival, but his hope for a future. Without that money, he'd be reduced to begging for work, sleeping rough, maybe even going hungry. With winter still months away, it should have been an easy choice. The heavy-set man who'd been bidding stepped forward slightly, a satisfied smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Wyatt had seen that expression before, the look of a man who believed he was about to acquire something valuable at a bargain price. The way his eyes lingered on the little girls made Wyatt's jaw clench. 35 going twice, the auctioneer continued, scanning the crowd for any last-minute bids. One of the twins, Mary or Margaret, he couldn't tell which, whispered something to her mother. Mabel Stover's composure finally cracked, just for a moment, and Wyatt saw her blink back tears before she straightened her shoulders again. The gesture was so achingly familiar, so reminiscent of his own mother's quiet strength in the face of impossible circumstances, that it felt like a fist around his heart. $40. The words left Wyatt's mouth before he'd consciously decided to speak them. His voice carried clearly across the square, cutting through the murmur of the crowd like a knife through cloth. Every head turned toward him, and he felt the weight of their stares, curious, calculating, hostile. The auctioneer paused, his gavel still raised. "Did I hear $40? Yes, sir." Wyatt stepped forward, his boots loud on the packed earth. $40? The heavy-set man whirled around, his face flushing an even deeper red. "Now hold on just a minute. 41, the man called. Out quickly, his voice sharp with anger. Wyatt felt his heart sink. He'd played his last card, and it wasn't enough. The crowd seemed to sense the drama unfolding, pressing closer like spectators at a prize fight. He could feel their excitement, their hunger for conflict and resolution. But then something unexpected happened. The thin man who'd been bidding earlier stepped back, shaking his head. "Too rich for my blood," he muttered, and several other potential bidders nodded in agreement. The price had climbed higher than most of them had expected or wanted to pay. The auctioneer looked around expectantly. "Do I hear 42? Silence stretched across the square like a held breath. Wyatt realized that most of the crowd had never seriously intended to bid. They'd come for the spectacle, for the grim entertainment of watching a family's tragedy unfold. Only a few men had the means and inclination to actually participate, and one by one they were dropping out. 41 going once, the auctioneer called. Wyatt's mind raced. He didn't have $41. Hell, he barely had 40. But as he looked at Mabel Stover's face, at the way she held herself with such quiet dignity despite everything, he found himself thinking about his mother again. She'd been sold once too, in a way married off to his father when she was barely 17 to pay her own family's debts. The arrangement had worked out, thankfully, and they'd found love together. But Wyatt had never forgotten the sadness in her eyes when she talked about leaving her childhood home, about having no choice in shaping her own future. 41 going twice, wait. Wyatt's voice rang out again, stopping the auctioneer mid-sentence. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his small leather pouch, feeling the weight of the coins through the worn fabric. "I need to count my money." It was a stalling tactic, and everyone knew it. But frontier etiquette demanded that a man be allowed to verify his funds before making a final bid. Wyatt's fingers worked slowly, deliberately, as he counted the coins one by one. 30-7 30-8 30-9 the bottom of the pouch. His fingers found something he'd forgotten about, a small silver button that had fallen off his coat weeks ago. It wasn't worth much, maybe 50 cents at most, but it was silver. He palmed it along with the 40th coin and looked up at the auctioneer. $40 and one silver button, he called out. Call it $41 even? A ripple of nervous laughter ran through the crowd. It was an unusual bid, technically legal but hardly conventional. The auctioneer frowned, clearly unsure how to proceed. The heavy-set man stepped forward, his face now purple with rage. This is ridiculous. I bid $41 in proper currency, not some collection of pocket trash. Silver is silver, Wyatt replied calmly, though his heart was hammering against his ribs. Territorial law says any man can pay his debts in legal tender, and that includes silver coin and silver goods. He was bluffing, of course. He had no idea what the territorial law actually said about such matters. But he spoke with enough confidence that several people in the crowd nodded as if they knew it to be true. The auctioneer looked uncertain. This was clearly outside his normal experience, and he glanced around as if hoping someone else would make the decision for him. Finally, he shrugged. Well, I suppose? Does anyone else wish to bid? The heavy-set man opened his mouth and seemed to think better of it. Making a higher bid would require him to reach into his own pocket for more money, and Wyatt could see him calculating whether these particular assets were worth the additional expense. After a long moment, he stepped back with a disgusted shake of his head. $41 then, the auctioneer said, sounding relieved to have the matter resolved. Going once? Going twice? The gavel fell with a sharp crack that seemed to echo through Wyatt's bones. Sold to the gentleman in the brown hat. The crowd began to disperse, the entertainment over, but Wyatt barely noticed. He felt simultaneously elated and terrified, as if he'd just jumped off a cliff without knowing whether there was water at the bottom. What had he done? What was he going to do now? He walked toward the platform on unsteady legs, his mind reeling with the implications of his impulsive decision. The auctioneer was already preparing the paperwork, his pen scratching across the official forms that would transfer legal responsibility for 3 human lives to a man who could barely take care of himself. As he approached, Mabel Stover looked up at him for the first time. Her eyes were a deep brown, he noticed, flecked with gold like autumn leaves. There was weariness there, and exhaustion, but also a kind of quiet strength that reminded him of his mother, of all the frontier women who had learned to endure whatever life threw at them. Mrs. Stover, he said, removing his hat. I'm Wyatt Cole. She nodded slowly, her gaze taking in his worn clothes, his weathered hands, the way he held himself like a man who had known better days. Mr. Cole, I'm not sure what to say. You don't need to say anything, Wyatt replied. Not yet, anyway. The twins had moved closer to their mother's chair, their small hands gripping the fabric of her dress. Up close, Wyatt could see the family resemblance more clearly. They had their mother's dark hair and delicate features, but their eyes held a wariness that no child should have to carry. This is Mary, Mabel said softly, placing a gentle hand on the head of the girl to her left. And this is Margaret. The other twin ducked slightly behind her mother's chair, clearly the shyer of the two. Pleased to meet you both, Wyatt said, crouching down to bring himself to their eye level. I know this is all very strange and frightening, but I want you to know that you're safe now. Mary, the bolder twin, studied his face with surprising intensity. Are you going to be mean to us? She asked in a small, clear voice. The question hit Wyatt like a physical blow. What had these children experienced that would make such a question necessary? No, he said firmly. I'm not going to be mean to you. I'm going to do my best to take care of you and your mama. Mr. Cole, the auctioneer interrupted, approaching with a sheaf of papers. If you could just sign here, ... and here, and initial. There. Wyatt stood and took the pen, his hand surprisingly steady as he signed his name to documents he didn't fully understand. With each signature, he was taking on responsibilities he wasn't sure he could handle, making promises he wasn't certain he could keep. That'll be $40 and ... One silver button, the auctioneer said, consulting his notes with a slight frown. Wyatt emptied his pouch into the man's waiting palm, the coins catching the afternoon sunlight as they changed hands. The silver button followed, looking small and insignificant among the larger coins. Just like that, he was broke. There's a wagon over by the courthouse, the auctioneer continued, apparently eager to conclude the unusual transaction. It's got Mrs. Stover's belongings, what little there is. You can take it with you, of course, included in the sale. Wyatt nodded, though his mind was already racing ahead to more immediate concerns. Where were they going to sleep tonight? What were they going to eat? He had a small camp about 3 miles outside of town, but it was barely adequate for one person, let alone a family of 4. Mr. Cole? Mabel's voice was quiet, but it carried a note of urgency that made him turn back. To her. If I might ask ... why did you do this? It was a fair question, and one he'd been asking himself. Why had he thrown away his last $40 on strangers? Why had he taken on responsibilities that would probably doom any chance he had of starting over? I guess, he said slowly, because it was the right thing to do. She studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether he was telling the truth. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her, because she nodded once, a gesture that somehow conveyed both gratitude and wariness. Well then, she said, reaching for her walking stick, I suppose we'd better collect our things and figure out what comes next. The wagon was older than Wyatt had expected, its wooden sides weathered gray and one wheel wobbling slightly as he hitched Juniper to the traces. The contents were sparse: a few pieces of furniture, some cooking utensils, a trunk that probably held what remained of the family's clothing, and something that made him pause, a small slate board, cracked down the middle but carefully wrapped in OILCLOTH. Mabel noticed his attention. I was a school teacher, she said simply, as if that explained everything. Before I married James. Before ... She gestured vaguely at her legs, and Wyatt understood that there was a story there, one that might take time to tell. The twins had climbed into the wagon bed without being asked, settling themselves among the few possessions with the practiced ease of children who had learned to make themselves small and unobtrusive. Mary clutched a corn-husk doll that had seen better days, while Margaret held what appeared to be a small wooden horse, its paint worn away by countless hours of play. It's not much, Mabel said, following his gaze. James made that horse for Margaret when she was 3. She's never gone to sleep without it. Wyatt helped her onto the wagon seat, noting how she favored her left leg and the careful way she positioned herself to minimize discomfort. She was lighter than he'd expected, and he caught a faint scent of lavender soap that seemed incongruous with their dire circumstances. Where are we going? She asked as he settled beside her and picked up the reins. It was a reasonable question, and one he probably should have considered before spending his last $40. His camp was barely more than a bedroll and a fire ring, certainly not suitable for a woman and 2 children. He'd been living day to day, working when he could find it, moving on when he couldn't. That kind of existence was no life for a family. I've got a place, he said, hoping it sounded more confident than he felt, about 3 miles north of town. It's not much, but it's shelter. What he didn't tell her was that shelter was a generous description for the abandoned cabin he'd been squatting in for the past week. The roof leaked, the door hung crooked on its hinges, and the single room would be cramped for 4 people. But it was better than sleeping under the stars, especially with winter eventually coming as they rolled out of Millbrook. Wyatt became acutely aware of the stares following them. Word of the unusual auction had already begun to spread, and he could see clusters of people talking in lowered voices, their eyes tracking the strange procession of the drifter Cowboy and his newly acquired family. They're talking about us, Mary observed from the wagon bed, her young voice matter of fact. Let them talk, Mabel replied firmly. People always have opinions about things they don't understand. The road north was little more than wagon ruts, through the prairie grass, and the going was slow. The wobbling wheel made an irregular rhythm that seemed to emphasize the awkwardness of their situation. What did you say to people you just bought at auction? How did you begin to build trust with strangers who had every reason to be suspicious of your motives? Mr. Cole, Mabel said after they traveled perhaps a mile in silence, I need you to understand something. I'm grateful for what you did back there. Truly I am. But I won't be... That is, I won't accept charity that comes with certain expectations. Wyatt felt heat rise in his cheeks as he understood her meaning. Ma'am, I want to assure you that I have no such intentions. What I did back there, it wasn't about acquiring property or anything else. It was about doing what seemed right. She studied his profile as he spoke, and he could feel the weight of her scrutiny. Then what do you expect from us? You spent your last money. I could see that plain enough. You must want something in return. It was a fair question, and one he'd been wrestling with himself. What did he expect? He hadn't thought that far ahead when he'd made his impulsive bid. Now, faced with the reality of the situation, he found himself grasping for an answer that made sense. I expect you to help out where you can, he said finally. Nothing more than anyone would expect from family staying together. Cooking, mending, teaching the girls. I'll provide what I can: shelter, protection, food when I can get work. We'll figure out the rest as we go. And if you can't find work, if winter comes and we're all still living on hope and good intentions, then we'll face that when it happens, Wyatt replied. I've been poor before, Mrs. Stover. Poor doesn't scare me as much as some other things. Margaret spoke up from the wagon bed, her voice so quiet they almost missed it. What scares you? Wyatt glanced back at the serious little face peering at him over the side of the wagon. It was an unexpectedly profound question from someone so young, and it deserved an honest answer. Being alone, he said after a moment. Making choices that hurt people instead of helping them. Becoming the kind of man who turns his back when someone needs help. The twins exchanged a look that seemed to communicate volumes. Wyatt got the impression that they'd developed their own silent language, the way twins sometimes did, born of necessity and their shared experiences of loss and uncertainty. The cabin came into view as they crested a small rise, and Wyatt felt his heart sink. He'd gotten used to its shortcomings over the past week, but seeing it through their eyes made him acutely aware of just how inadequate it really was. The roof sagged in the middle, several boards had fallen away from the walls, and what had once been a front porch was now little more than a few rotting planks. It needs some work, he admitted, pulling the wagon to a stop in front of what had once been a yard but was now mostly weeds and bare earth. Mabel was quiet for a long moment, taking in the state of their new home. When she finally spoke, her voice was carefully neutral. How long have you been staying here? About a week. The previous owner, well, there wasn't one really. It's been abandoned for a while. I've been making some repairs, but he trailed off, unsure how to explain that his improvements had been limited to patching the worst holes and clearing out the debris left by previous transients. To his surprise, Mabel smiled the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. James, and I started with less, she said. Much less. We built our first home from sod and hope, and it wasn't much prettier than this. At least this one has real walls. The twins had already climbed down from the wagon and were exploring their new surroundings with the resilience of children who had learned to adapt quickly to changing circumstances. Mary had found a patch of wildflowers growing near what might once have been a garden, while Margaret was examining the structure with the serious attention of a much older person. The door's broken, Margaret announced, pushing on the warped wood that hung askew in its frame. I can fix that, Wyatt said, though he wasn't entirely sure it was true. His carpentry skills were basic at best, learned through necessity rather than training. Can you really? Mary asked, looking up from her flowers. Papa used to fix things, but then he got sick and couldn't anymore. The casual mention of their father was like a door opening briefly into their past, giving Wyatt a glimpse of the life they'd lost. He found himself wondering about James Stover, about what kind of man he'd been and how he died. But those were questions for another time, when trust had been built and wounds had begun to heal. I can learn, he said instead. Sometimes that's the best any of us can do, learn as we go, and try not to make the same mistakes twice. Mabel was already directing the unloading of the wagon with the efficiency of someone accustomed to making the best of difficult situations. The few pieces of furniture were arranged to create distinct areas within the single room, a sleeping area. For her and the girls, a space for cooking and eating, and a corner where Wyatt could spread his bedroll without intruding on their privacy. As the afternoon wore on, and they worked together to make the cabin habitable, Wyatt began to see glimpses of who these people really were beneath the circumstances that had brought them together. Mabel moved with careful deliberation, her walking stick always within reach, but her disability didn't slow her down as much as he'd expected. She had a teacher's way of organizing tasks, breaking down the overwhelming job of settling it into manageable pieces. The twins worked with a quiet cooperation that spoke of shared burdens and mutual dependence. They seemed to anticipate each other's needs, and they both watched their mother with the careful attention of children who had learned to monitor the adults in their lives for signs of distress or pain. By evening, the cabin looked almost livable. It was still far from comfortable, but it felt like a home rather than just a shelter. Mabel had managed to prepare a simple meal from their meager supplies, beans and cornbread cooked over the repaired fire that Wyatt had built in the cracked hearth. As they sat around the rough wooden table that had come with the wagon, Wyatt realized that this was the first time in years he'd shared a meal with other people. The experience was both comforting and unsettling, a reminder of all the things he'd given up when he'd chosen the solitary life of a drifter. "Mr. Cole," Mary said, breaking the comfortable silence, "are you going to stay with us?" It was another of those unexpectedly direct questions that children were so good at asking. Wyatt found himself looking at three faces turned toward him with varying degrees of hope and uncertainty. "Yes," he said, surprised by how easily the word came. "I'm going to stay." The first week passed in a blur of small discoveries and careful negotiations. Wyatt learned that Margaret talked to herself when she thought no one was listening, that Mary had inherited her mother's stubborn streak, and that Mabel possessed an almost supernatural ability to stretch meager supplies into satisfying meals. Also learned that the twins had never had a man's consistent presence in their lives. Their father had been sick for most of their early years, confined to bed during his final months, and they approached Wyatt with a mixture of curiosity and wariness that reminded him of young colts testing the boundaries of a new pasture. On the fourth morning, he woke to find Mary sitting cross-legged beside his bedroll, watching him with intense concentration. "What are you doing?" he asked, keeping his voice gentle despite his startlement. "Mama said you might leave while we were." "Sleeping," she said matter-of-factly. I wanted to see if she was right. The casual revelation hit him harder than he'd expected. Of course, Mabel would be worried about that. She'd already lost one man to circumstances beyond her control, and now she was dependent on the whims of a stranger who'd bought them at auction. The temporary nature of their arrangement must weigh on her constantly. "I'm not going anywhere," he told Mary, sitting up and reaching for his boots. "I gave my word, and a man's word is about the most important thing he owns." Mary considered this gravely. "Papa used to say that too, but then he died anyway." "Sometimes things happen that are beyond a person's control," Wyatt said carefully. "But as long as I'm able, I'll be here." That afternoon, he found himself with some time while Mabel worked with the twins on their letters. She'd been continuing their education, despite having no formal schoolhouse, using her cracked slate and pieces of charcoal to teach them reading and arithmetic. The sight of her bent over the slate, patiently guiding Margaret's small hand as she formed letters, stirred something in Wyatt that he hadn't felt in years. He'd been whittling absently while he watched them, his pocket knife shaping a piece of scrapwood into something that was beginning to resemble a small horse. It was mindless work, the kind of thing his hands did automatically when his mind was elsewhere. But as the shape emerged, he realized he was creating something deliberate. Margaret's wooden horse had lost an ear sometime during their journey from town, and he'd noticed how carefully she cradled the damaged toy each night. The new horse wouldn't replace the one her father had made, but it might serve as a companion for it. When he finished, He found himself holding a crude but recognizable horse, complete with a flowing mane and prancing hooves. It wasn't fine craftsmanship, by any means, but it was honest work, made with good intentions. "Margaret," he called softly, not wanting to interrupt the lesson, but knowing the children's attention spans were limited. "Could you come here for a moment?" She approached cautiously, her eyes moving between his face and the wooden figure in his hands. When he held it out to her, she took it with the careful reverence of someone who had learned not to take gifts for granted. "For me?" she whispered. "For you. I noticed your other horse had gotten hurt during the move. Thought he might like some company." Margaret turned the wooden horse over in her small hands, examining it from every angle. Then, without warning, she darted forward and wrapped her arms around Wyatt's neck in a fierce hug that lasted only a few seconds, but somehow managed to crack something open in his chest that he'd thought was permanently sealed. "Thank you," she breathed against his ear, and then she was gone, running back to show her mother and sister the treasure he'd carved for her Dot. Mary appeared at his side a few minutes later, her expression thoughtful. "Are you going to make me something too?" Wyatt smiled at her directness. "Would you like me to?" "Maybe, but not a horse. I like different things than Margaret." "What kind of things do you like?" Mary considered this seriously. "Birds. I like how they can fly away when things get scary." That evening, Wyatt began work on a small wooden bird, its wings spread as if caught in the moment of taking flight. It took him 3 days to get the proportions right, working by firelight after the family had settled for the night. When he finally presented it to Mary, her reaction was more subdued than her sister's had been, but he caught her sleeping with it, clutched in her hand the next morning. The gifts seemed to mark a turning point in their relationship. The twins began seeking him out during the day, asking questions about his work, about the places he'd been, about skills they wanted to learn. Margaret was fascinated by his knife and the way he could shape wood with it, while Mary wanted to know about the different birds he'd seen in his travels. Doc Mabel watched these developing relationships with careful attention, and Wyatt could see her evaluating each interaction, measuring his words and actions against some internal standard she developed for judging the trustworthiness of men around her daughters. "You're good with them," she said one evening as they sat outside the cabin, watching the twins chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. "They're good girls," he replied. "Easy to be good with." Not all men would see it that way. Children can be burdensome to someone who's not used to them. Wyatt was quiet for a moment, watching Mary capture a firefly in her cupped hands and call excitedly for her sister to come see. "I had a sister once," he said finally. "Little thing, maybe 5 years old when I left home. Always following me around, asking questions, wanting to help with everything I did." "What happened to her?" "Fever took her the winter after I left. I got word about 6 months later." He paused, old guilt rising in his throat like bile. "I should have been there." Mabel's voice was gentle when she responded. "Sometimes being there isn't enough. Sometimes bad things happen, no matter how much we love someone or how hard we try to protect them." "Is that what happened to your husband?" She nodded, her gaze fixed on the twins. "James was a good man, but he was never strong. The work here, the harsh winters, the constant worry about money and crops, and making ends meet ... it wore him down. When the fever came, he just didn't have anything left to fight it with." "I'm sorry." "So am I, but I learned something from watching him struggle. I learned that surviving isn't just about being strong or stubborn or determined. Sometimes it's about knowing when to accept help, when to lean on other people instead of trying to carry everything yourself." She turned to look at him then, and in the fading light, her eyes seemed to hold depths he hadn't noticed before. "What?" "I'm trying to say, Mr. Cole, is that this arrangement we have, it doesn't have to be about charity or obligation. It can be about people helping each other, because that's what decent folks do." Wyatt felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of tension he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. "I'd like that," he said simply. Over the following days, their interactions became easier, more natural. Mabel began consulting him about decisions regarding the girls' education and daily routines. while he found himself seeking her advice about practical matters around the homestead. She had a sharp mind for logistics and planning, skills honed by years of managing a household on limited resources. The twins, meanwhile, seemed to be thriving in their new environment. Away from the whispers and pitying looks of the townspeople, they displayed a resilience and curiosity that reminded Wyatt daily of why he'd made his impulsive decision at the auction. But it was during a trip to town for supplies that Wyatt got his first real taste of the challenges they would face as a makeshift family. He'd taken the twins with him while Mabel rested. Her leg had been bothering her more than usual, and the stares and whispered comments began the moment they entered Henderson's general store. "That's them," he heard someone say. "The ones he bought at auction. Shame, really. Those poor children don't know what they've gotten themselves into. Man like that, no family, no reputation. What's he really want with a woman and 2 little girls?" The implications in the whispers made Wyatt's hands clench into fists, but he forced himself to conduct his business calmly, the twins staying close to his sides as he gathered the few supplies their meager resources could afford. It was Mary who finally spoke up, her young voice cutting through the adult murmurs with startling clarity. "Mr. Cole takes care of us," she announced to the store in general. "He fixes things and makes us presents, and doesn't yell when we ask too many questions." The store fell silent, and Wyatt felt a surge of protective pride that nearly overwhelmed him. These children, who had every reason to be suspicious of adult motives, were defending him to a room full of strangers. "That's right," Margaret added, stepping slightly in front of her sister, in a gesture that reminded Wyatt achingly of their mother. "He's good to us." Henderson, the store owner, cleared his throat awkwardly. "Well then," he said, his voice overly hearty, "I guess that's what matters, isn't it?" But Wyatt could see the doubt in the man's eyes, the lingering suspicion that would probably follow them wherever they went. He was beginning to understand that their unconventional family would have to prove itself over and over again. That acceptance would be earned in small increments rather than granted freely. As they walked back to the wagon, Mary slipped her hand into his. "Don't listen to them," she said seriously. "Mama says people talk when they don't understand things, but that doesn't make them right." "Your mama's a wise woman," Wyatt replied, squeezing her small hand gently. "Are you going to marry her?" Margaret asked from his other side, the question delivered with the same matter-of-fact directness that seemed to run in the family. Wyatt nearly stumbled. That's not something that's been discussed. But you like her, don't you? And she likes you. I can tell." "It's more complicated than that, Margaret. Your mama and we're still getting to know each other." "And she's still grieving your papa," Mary nodded sagely. "Mama cries sometimes when she thinks we're sleeping, but not as much as before." The revelation sat heavily on Wyatt's chest during the ride home. He'd been so focused on the practical aspects of their arrangement, providing shelter, finding work, making ends meet, that he hadn't fully considered the emotional complexity of what they were all navigating. Mabel was still a grieving widow. The twins were still adjusting to the loss of their father, and he was a man with his own complicated past, trying to figure out where he fit in their story. But as they pulled up to the cabin and he saw Mabel waiting for them on the front steps she'd helped him repair, her face lighting up at the sight of their return, Wyatt realized that maybe figuring it out was less important than simply living it day by day, choice by choice, act of kindness by act of kindness. Maybe that was enough to build a future on. 3 weeks into their new life together, Wyatt found himself chopping wood behind the cabin when he heard Mabel's sharp intake of breath from inside. He dropped the axe and hurried through the door to find her sitting on the edge of her bed, her face pale and drawn with pain. "What's wrong?" he asked, kneeling beside her. "Nothing serious," she said through gritted teeth. "Just my leg acting up. The weather's changing. It always gets worse when a storm's coming." Through the window, Wyatt could see the dark clouds gathering on the horizon, confirming her prediction. The twins looked up from where they'd been playing with their wooden toys, their expressions immediately shifting to the watchful concern of children who had learned to monitor their mother's condition. "Is there anything I can do?" Wyatt asked. Mabel's hand moved instinctively to a thin chain around her neck, and for the first time, Wyatt noticed what hung from it, a simple gold wedding band. She'd been wearing it there, instead of on her finger. He realized, close to her heart, but removed from her daily life in a way that spoke of grief still being processed. "There's a bottle in my trunk," she said quietly. "Laudanum? The doctor in our old town gave it to me for the bad days." Wyatt found the small brown bottle nestled among her few personal belongings. As he handed it to her, his fingers brushed hers briefly, and he was struck by how cold her skin felt despite the warmth of the day. "How often do you have days like this?" he asked. "More often than I'd like," she admitted, measuring out a careful dose of the medicine. "The wagon accident? It didn't just break my leg. It crushed some things that never healed quite right. Most days I can manage, but sometimes—" She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Wyatt was beginning to understand the true extent of what she dealt with daily, the constant background of pain that she managed with such quiet dignity that it was easy to forget how much she was carrying. "Mama needs to rest when the storms come," Mary explained matter-of-factly. "Papa used to tell us stories on those days, so she wouldn't have to talk." The casual mention of their father sent a pang through Wyatt's chest. These children had already learned to be caregivers, to adjust their needs to accommodate their mother's limitations. It was a heavy burden for such young shoulders. "Would you like me to tell you a story?" he offered. Margaret nodded shyly, while Mary studied him with the calculating look she got when she was deciding whether to trust him with something important. "What kind of stories do you know?" she asked. Wyatt settled into the chair by Mabel's bed, thinking. He wasn't much of a storyteller, but he'd traveled enough to have accumulated a few tales worth sharing. "How about I tell you about the time I saw a family of bears learning to fish in a mountain stream?" As he began the story, embellishing details to make it more engaging for his young audience, he noticed Mabel's breathing gradually becoming easier. The laudanum was taking effect, but more than that, she seemed to relax as she listened to his voice, weaving a tale of patient mother bears, teaching their cubs the art of catching salmon. The storm arrived as evening fell, bringing with it a steady rain that drummed against the cabin's patched roof. Wyatt had managed to repair most of the major leaks, but a few persistent drips still found their way inside, requiring the strategic placement of pots and pans to catch the water. "I should have fixed that corner better," he muttered, adjusting a bucket to catch a particularly persistent leak. "James used to say the same thing," Mabel said softly from her bed. "Every storm, he'd promise to get up there and fix it properly. But somehow, there was always something more urgent that needed attention." It was the most she'd talked about her late husband, and Wyatt found himself curious about the man who had won her heart and left such a void in their lives. "What was he like?" he asked, settling back into his chair as the twins curled up on. Their shared bedroll nearby. Mabel was quiet for so long that he thought she might have drifted off to sleep. When she finally spoke, her voice was distant, as if she was seeing something beyond the confines of their small cabin. "Gentle," she said. "That's the word that comes to mind first. He was the gentlest man I ever knew. Not weak, never weak, but he had this way of approaching the world like it was something precious that needed to be handled with care." She shifted carefully, favoring her injured leg. "He proposed to me with wildflowers instead of a ring, because he said anything that beautiful should grow and change rather than stay the same forever. I kept some of those flowers pressed in my Bible until the fire." "Fire?" "The cabin we lived in before. It burned down the winter before James died. We lost almost everything. That's when the debts started piling up, when everything began to fall apart." Wyatt was beginning to piece together the cascade of misfortunes that had led this family to the auction block. It wasn't just one catastrophic event, but a series of smaller disasters that had gradually overwhelmed their ability to cope. "He would have liked you," Mabel continued, and Wyatt felt something tight in his chest loosen slightly. "James believed in the goodness of people, even when they disappointed him. He would have appreciated what you did for us." The rain continued through the night, and Wyatt found himself lying awake, listening to the rhythm of the drops and the soft breathing of his makeshift family. Sometime in the early hours, he heard Mabel stir restlessly, a small sound of pain. escaping her lips despite her obvious efforts to remain quiet. Without thinking, he rose from his bedroll and moved to the chair beside her bed. "Can't sleep either?" she whispered. "The storm," he said, though they both knew it wasn't really the weather keeping him awake. "Thank you," she said after a moment. "For today, for the stories, for not making me feel like a burden." "You're not a burden, Mabel," he said, using her first name for the first time. The intimacy of it felt both natural and significant in the darkness of the storm-wrapped cabin. "None of you are. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if you hadn't been at that auction," she said. "If someone else had bought us, or if no one had bid at all." Wyatt had wondered the same thing, though he tried not to dwell on it. The possibilities were uniformly grim, and thinking about them served no useful purpose. "But I was there," he said simply. "And here we are." "Here we are," she agreed, and something in her voice suggested that she was beginning to see their situation, not just as survival, but as something that might grow into something more. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the storm having passed as quickly as it had arrived. Mabel was moving better, the worst of the pain having subsided with the dropping barometric pressure, and the twins were eager to explore the rain-washed world outside their cabin. Wyatt spent the morning on the roof, properly sealing the leaks that had plagued them during the storm. It was careful work that required patience and attention to detail, but he found satisfaction in the methodical process of solving problems that had concrete solutions. "You're getting good at that," Mabel observed from below, where she sat on a stump watching him work. "Practice," he replied, positioning another piece of tar paper. "I'm learning that most things get easier if you do them enough times." "Is that what this is?" she asked, gesturing to encompass their entire situation. "Practice?" Wyatt paused in his work, considering the question. "Maybe," he said finally. "Practice at being a family. Practice at trusting each other. Practice at building something that lasts. And if we're not very good at it at first, then we keep practicing until we get better." That afternoon, while the twins played in the puddles left by the storm, Mabel asked Wyatt to help her with something she'd been putting off. She led him to her trunk and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in faded cloth. "These were James's," she said, unwrapping what turned out to be a set of carpentry tools, not fine instruments, but honest working tools that showed the wear of regular use. I thought maybe you could use them." Wyatt picked up a hand plane, running his thumb along the blade edge. It had been carefully maintained, sharpened, and oiled despite the family's circumstances. "These are good tools," he said. "James made most of our furniture with them. The little horse he carved for Margaret, a chest at the foot of my bed. He always said that a man who could work with his hands would never go hungry." The gift felt significant beyond its practical value. These weren't just tools. They were a connection to the man who had loved this family before him, a passing of responsibility from one protector to another. "I'll take good care of them," Wyatt promised. "I know you will," Mabel replied, and the trust in her voice was worth more to him than all the wages he'd ever earned. That evening, as they sat around their dinner table, sharing the simple meal Mabel had prepared, Wyatt realized that something fundamental had shifted in their relationship. The careful politeness of their early days had given way to something more comfortable, more genuine. They were no longer strangers thrown together by circumstance. They were becoming something new, something that didn't have a name yet, but felt real and solid in ways that surprised him. "Mr. Cole," Mary said, interrupting his thoughts, "can you teach us to use those tools?" "I'm still learning myself," he admitted. "But we could learn together, if your mama thinks it's all right." "Papa tried to teach us," Margaret added. "But we were too little then. Maybe we're big enough now." Mabel smiled at her daughter's enthusiasm. "I think that would be a fine idea." James would have liked knowing his tools were being used to teach his girls. As they cleared the table together, moving around each other, with the easy coordination of people who had learned each other's rhythms, Wyatt caught Mabel's eye across the small room. She was still wearing her husband's ring on the chain around her neck, still carrying the weight of grief and loss. But there was something new in her expression, a cautious hope that hadn't been there before. It was a beginning, Wyatt realized. Not an ending to what had come before, but a beginning of what might come next. And for the first time in years, he found himself looking forward to tomorrow, instead of just trying to survive it. The morning that would change everything started like any other. Wyatt was teaching the twins to sand a piece of wood smooth. There, small hands gripping the sandpaper with determined concentration, when two riders approached the cabin. The sound of hoofbeats on the hard-packed earth made him look up from his work, and what he saw made his blood run cold. The men wore the kind of clothes that marked them as more than simple cowboys' tailored coats, despite the heat. Clean boots, and the unmistakable bearing of people accustomed to having their authority respected without question. The older of the two, a man with silver hair and calculating eyes, dismounted with the fluid grace of someone who spent considerable time in the saddle. "Mr. Cole, I presume?" the man said, approaching with his hat in his hand, but his manner anything but humble. "I'm Harrison Blackwood, Territorial Land Commissioner. This is my associate, Mr. Garrett." Wyatt stood slowly, wiping sawdust from his hands while keeping himself positioned between the visitors and the children. "What can I do for you, Mr. Blackwood?" "We're here about a matter of some delicacy," Blackwood replied, his eyes moving past Wyatt to take in the modest improvements they'd made to the cabin. "It's come to our attention that you've been caring for the Stover family." "That's right," Wyatt said carefully. "Well, there's been some concern in town about the propriety of the arrangement. A single man living with a widow and her children. You understand how that might look to folks." Mabel appeared in the doorway, her walking stick in hand and her spine straight, despite the obvious pain the movement caused her. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice carrying a teacher's authority, "how unexpected to see you here. Mrs. Stover." Blackwood's smile was thin and didn't reach his eyes. "You're looking well, considering your circumstances. What do you want?" Mabel asked bluntly, moving to stand beside Wyatt. The twins had stopped their sanding and were watching the adults with the alert wariness of children who had learned to recognize danger. "There have been questions raised about the legitimacy of your arrangement here," Blackwood continued. "Some folks think it might be better for all concerned if more suitable arrangements were made for you and the children." "Suitable how?" Wyatt asked, though he suspected he already knew where this conversation was heading. "There's a charitable institution in Topeka that specializes in caring for unfortunate women and orphaned children. Very respectable, run by the Methodist Church. They've graciously agreed to take in Mrs. Stover and the girls, provided we can arrange transportation." "My daughters are not orphans," Mabel said firmly, "and I am perfectly capable of making my own decisions about where I live and with whom." Garrett, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward. He was younger than Blackwood, with the kind of lean build and watchful eyes that suggested he was accustomed to violence. "Now, ma'am, there's no need to get upset. We're just trying to look out for your best interests." "Our best interests," Wyatt said, "are being served just fine right here." Blackwood's expression hardened slightly. "Mr. Cole, I don't think you fully understand the situation. There are legal questions about this homestead, about the validity of the original land claim. Questions that could be resolved much more easily if there weren't complications." The word complications hung in the air between them like a threat. Wyatt felt the familiar sensation of being maneuvered into a corner, the same feeling he'd had during his trial years ago when he'd realized that truth and justice weren't necessarily the same thing. "What kind of legal questions?" Mabel asked, but Wyatt could see in her eyes that she already suspected the answer. "The original filing on this land was done by Jane Stover, but there are irregularities in the paperwork. Questions about whether all the proper procedures were followed, whether the required improvements were actually made within the specified time frame." Wyatt's hands clenched into fists. "This is about the land, isn't it? Someone wants this particular piece of ground, and you're trying to find a legal way to take it." "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Cole," Blackwood said, his voice carrying a note of warning. "I'd be careful about making statements you can't prove." But Mabel was already moving, her walking stick tapping against the porch boards as she went back into the cabin. She returned a moment later, carrying a leather portfolio that Wyatt recognized as having come from her trunk. "Here," she said, thrusting the papers at Blackwood. "James's copy of the homestead filing, the proof of improvements, the survey records. Everything's in order, and you know it." Blackwood took the papers with obvious reluctance, glancing through them with the air of a man who already knew what he would find. "These appear to be preliminary documents," he said finally, "not the final recorded versions." "Because the final versions are supposed to be on file at the territorial office," Mabel snapped. "The office where you work, Mr. Blackwood. Unfortunately, there was a fire at the territorial office last month. Many records were lost, without the proper documentation." "How convenient," Wyatt said, his voice deadly quiet. The twins had moved closer to their mother, sensing the tension in the adult conversation, even if they didn't understand all the words. Mary reached up to take Mabel's free hand, while Margaret pressed against her side. "Look," Garrett said, his tone attempting reasonableness, "nobody wants any trouble here. If you folks would just cooperate, make this transition smooth and peaceful, I'm sure we could work out some kind of arrangement. Maybe even a little something extra to help with your travel expenses." It was a bribe, barely disguised, and the casual way it was offered told Wyatt that these men were accustomed to people accepting their version of reality without question. "And if we don't cooperate?" Wyatt asked. Blackwood's smile was cold. "Well, then things might become complicated. Questions might be raised about Mr. Cole's background, about his suitability as a guardian for impressionable children. Questions about Mrs. Stover's mental state grief can affect a person's judgment. After all, questions about whether these children are receiving proper care and education." The threat was clear: submit to their demands or face a battle that would be fought with weapons far more devastating than Gunn's reputation, legal manipulation, and the power of men who controlled the systems that ordinary people depended on. For justice. "You bastards," Wyatt said, taking a step forward. "Mr. Cole," Blackwood said sharply, "I'd remind you that threatening territorial officials is a serious crime." "I wasn't threatening," Wyatt replied, though his voice carried menace. "I was making an observation." Mabel placed a restraining hand on his arm. "What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Blackwood?" "Simple. You and the children come with us today. Mr. Cole finds somewhere else to live. The land reverts to territorial. Control pending proper documentation of ownership. Everyone gets what they need. Except us," Mary said suddenly, her young voice cutting through the adult, maneuvering with startling clarity. "Except we don't get what we need." Blackwood looked down at her with the kind of patronizing smile adults reserved for children who had spoken out of turn. "And what is it you think you need, little girl?" Mary looked up at him with her mother's steady gaze. "We need to stay together. We need Mr. Cole to stay with us. We need our home." "Sometimes," Blackwood said, his voice taking on a lecturing tone, "what we think we need and what's actually best for us are different things." "No," Margaret said quietly, stepping forward to stand beside her sister. "You're wrong." The simple conviction in the child's voice seemed to deflate some of Blackwood's authority. For a moment, he looked uncertain, as if he'd expected easy compliance, rather than resistance from every member of this makeshift family. "Mrs. Stover," he said, turning back to Mabel, "surely you can see that we're offering you a chance at respectability, at security for your children. What kind of future can they have here, living in poverty with a man who has no legal relationship to them?" "The kind of future," Mabel said steadily, "where they learn that families are built on love and commitment, not legal documents and social conventions." Wyatt felt something shift in his chest at her words, a recognition that went deeper than gratitude or friendship. She was fighting for them, not just for herself and her children, but for him, for the unlikely family they built together in defiance of conventional wisdom. "You have until tomorrow evening to reconsider," Blackwood said, apparently recognizing that this conversation wasn't going the way he'd planned. "After that, we'll be forced to take more official action." As the two men mounted their horses and rode away, Wyatt felt the weight of the challenge settling on his shoulders. They were being given a choice, but it wasn't really a choice at all: submit or face destruction through legal and social manipulation. "They want this land for a reason," Mabel said quietly, watching the riders disappear over the rise. Something more than just getting rid of undesirable residents. Any idea what that might be? Mabel was quiet for a long moment, her hand still resting on Mary's head. James found something, she said finally. The summer before he died. He was always poking around, looking at rocks and soil samples, trying to figure out why some parts of our land seemed different from others. Different how? The water table was higher in some areas. The soil had a different color, a different texture. He thought ... She paused, glancing at the twins before continuing. He thought there might be minerals, maybe even silver. Wyatt felt the pieces clicking into place. Silver would explain the sudden interest in their land, the convenient fire that destroyed the homestead records, the pressure to remove them peacefully rather than simply evicting them through normal legal channels. Did he ever prove it? Find actual evidence? He was working on it when he got sick. But he hid his survey notes, his samples, everything he'd collected. He said if he was right, there would be people who'd try to take it away from us. Where did he hide it? Mabel smiled grimly. That's what we need to find out. James was careful, methodical. If he found something valuable enough to hide, he would have left a way for us to find it again. That evening, after the twins had gone to sleep, Wyatt and Mabel began systematically searching the cabin and the immediate area around it. They were looking for something that might not even exist, following clues left by a dead man to find evidence of a discovery that could either save them or destroy them. It was Margaret who found it the next morning, entirely by accident. She'd been playing with her wooden horses near the fireplace when one of them rolled behind the stones. Reaching for it, her small fingers found a loose stone that shifted when she pressed against it. "Mama," she called out, "this rock moves." Behind the stone was a space just large enough to hold a wrapped bundle of papers and a small cloth bag. With trembling hands, Mabel unwrapped the document survey notes in James's careful handwriting, sketches of the land with various areas, marked and annotated, and watercolor samples that clearly showed traces of silver ore. The cloth bag contained rock samples, and even to Wyatt's untrained eye, some of them showed the telltale glints that suggested precious metal. "He found it," Mabel whispered, her voice filled with wonder and grief. "James actually found silver on our land." But as Wyatt studied the survey notes, he realized that their discovery brought as much danger as hope. If Blackwood and his associates knew or suspected what James had found, they wouldn't be content with simple eviction. They'd want to eliminate any witnesses to their illegal seizure of valuable land. "We have to be careful about this," he said, rewrapping the documents. "This information makes us dangerous to them." "It also makes us valuable," Mabel replied, but Wyatt could see the fear in her eyes. She understood as well as he did that sometimes being valuable was just another way of being in danger. As they prepared for what was sure to be a final confrontation, Wyatt realized that their quiet life of building trust and learning to be a family was about to be tested in ways they could never have imagined. The stakes had risen beyond personal survival to questions of justice, truth, and whether ordinary people could prevail against those who believed power gave them the right to take whatever they wanted. Tomorrow, they would find out what they were really made of. The revelation came like a thunderclap on a clear day, shattering everything Wyatt thought he knew about their situation. He was studying James's survey notes by lamplight while Mabel put the twins to bed when she said something that made his blood freeze in his veins. "I never told you how James really died, did I?" Wyatt looked up from the carefully drawn maps and mineral notations. "You said fever took him. That's what everyone believes. That's what I let them believe." Mabel sat down heavily across from him, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for the cup of coffee that had long since grown cold. "But fever doesn't leave bruises on a man's throat. Fever doesn't break a man's ribs." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a funeral pyre. Wyatt felt the familiar sensation of the ground shifting beneath his feet, the same feeling he'd had years ago when he'd realized that his own troubles went far deeper than simple accusations of cattle theft. "Someone killed him," he said, "not really a question. 3 someones. They came in the middle of the night, maybe 6 weeks before he died. I was sleeping, but James was awake. He'd been having trouble sleeping toward the end, the pain in his chest keeping him up. He heard them coming and woke me, told me to take the girls and hide in the root cellar. Mabel's voice was steady, but Wyatt could see the cost of telling this story in the lines around her eyes, in the way her fingers gripped the coffee cup like an anchor. I wanted to stay to help him, but he insisted. Said if something happened to him, the girls would need their mother. So I took Mary and Margaret and hid in that dark, cramped space while strange men tore our cabin apart, looking for something. The survey notes. I think so. James had been acting strange for weeks before that, nervous and excited at the same time. He'd been taking longer trips away from the cabin, sometimes gone for days at a time. When he came back, he'd have rock samples and pages of notes that he'd hide somewhere different each time. Wyatt thought about the systematic way the hidden documents had been concealed behind the fireplace stone, the careful organization of the mineral samples. They tortured him for hours. I could hear ... double quotes. She stopped, swallowing hard. I could hear him trying not to scream. They kept asking him where he'd hidden it, not what it was, just where it was. Like they already knew he'd found something valuable. The implications were staggering. This wasn't random violence or even simple claim jumping. This was organized, planned, carried out by people who had prior knowledge of James's discovery. People who had been watching him, waiting for the right moment to strike. They never found what they were looking for, Wyatt said. No, James never told them, even when ... Mabel's voice broke slightly. Even when they did things that no man should have to endure, he never gave them what they wanted. What happened after? They left him alive, but barely. He made it through the rest of the night, long enough to tell me where he'd hidden the real survey, not the one behind the fireplace. That was just his preliminary notes. Long enough to make me promise that if anything happened to him, I'd never tell anyone what really occurred that night. Wyatt felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool evening air. Why not? Why protect the men who killed him? Because he knew they'd come back for me and the girls if they thought we had what they wanted. He figured if everyone believed. He died of natural causes. We might be safe as long as we never tried to develop the mineral rights ourselves. But that was before you lost the homestead to debt. James lingered for 6 weeks after the attack. 6 weeks when he couldn't work, couldn't provide for us, couldn't do anything but lie in bed and slowly die from internal injuries. The medical bills, the lost income, the fact that we couldn't harvest that year's crop. By the time he finally passed, we owed more money than the land was worth. Wyatt was beginning to see the full scope of the conspiracy they were facing. The debt auction was planned. Someone knew about the silver and arranged for your family to lose the homestead, probably figuring they could buy it cheap once you were forced off. And when you interfered with that plan by buying us instead of letting us be separated, I became a problem that needed to be solved. Wyatt felt anger building in his chest, a cold, controlled fury that was far more dangerous than the hot rage he'd felt during yesterday's confrontation. Blackwood and his people, they're connected to the men who killed James. Mabel nodded miserably. I recognized Garrett. He was one of the 3 who came that night. When I saw him yesterday, I knew we were in more trouble than we'd imagined. Why didn't you tell me then? Because I was afraid you'd do something reckless. And because ... She looked toward the corner where the twins slept peacefully on their shared bedroll. Because I was afraid that if you knew the truth, you'd realize how dangerous it is to stay with us, and you'd leave. The accusation hit him harder than any physical blow. That she could think, even for a moment, that he would abandon them when they needed him, most spoke to depths of abandonment and betrayal that went far beyond anything he'd suspected. Mabel, he said quietly, I need you to understand something. There is nothing that could make me walk away from you and those girls. Not danger, not money, not threats, not the law itself. You're stuck with me. She looked up at him then, tears streaming down her face, and for the first time since he'd known her, she looked like the young woman she really was, rather than the careworn widow she'd been forced to become. There's more, she whispered. James found documents, proof that Blackwood and others in the territorial government have been systematically defrauding homesteaders, stealing land with valuable mineral deposits. He wasn't the first, and we won't be the last. Where are these documents? Hidden with the real survey. James was going to take everything to the federal authorities in Topeka, but he never got the chance. Wyatt felt the pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. My trial, he said slowly. The cattle theft accusations. They were false, but the timing ... What do you mean? I was working for a rancher outside of Dodge City. Thomas Garrett's same last name as the man who was here. Yesterday. The missing cattle showed up after I was run out of town, but by then the damage was done. You think they're related? I think I was getting too close to something I wasn't supposed to see. There were irregularities in land transfers, homesteaders losing their claims under suspicious circumstances. I started asking questions. Mabel was staring at him with dawning comprehension. They destroyed your reputation to silence you. And when that wasn't enough, when I kept moving from town to town, they made sure word of my crimes followed me everywhere I went. Wyatt felt the bitter satisfaction of finally understanding the pattern that had shaped his life for the past several years. I've been running from a lie designed to keep me from uncovering the truth. So what do we do now? Before Wyatt could answer, a sound from outside made them both freeze. Hoofbeats, multiple horses, approaching at a steady pace that suggested purpose rather than chance. Through the cabin's single window, Wyatt could see torchlight flickering in the darkness. They're not waiting until tomorrow, he said, moving quickly to blow out the lamp that had been providing their light dot in the sudden darkness. He could hear Mabel moving carefully toward the twins, probably to wake them and prepare them for whatever was coming. But as he peered through the window, counting the approaching riders, Wyatt realized that this wasn't going to be another polite conversation about relocation. How many? Mabel whispered. 6, maybe 7. Too many for talking. The root cellar, she said urgently. You and the girls can hide there while I... No. His voice was firm, final. We face this together, or not at all. Wyatt, they killed James. They won't hesitate to. Then we'd better make sure they don't get the chance. As the riders drew closer, Wyatt could make out Blackwood's voice giving orders in the kind of crisp, authoritative tone that spoke of military experience. These weren't just corrupt officials and hired thugs. They were organized, disciplined, and probably armed with more than just threats. Mrs. Stover, Blackwood called out as the group surrounded the cabin. Mr. Cole, we... No, you're in there. Come out now, and this can still be resolved peacefully. Wyatt grabbed James's old hunting rifle from where it hung on the wall and checked the ammunition. It was loaded, but he had only a handful of extra cartridges. Against 7 armed men, it wouldn't be enough for a prolonged fight, but it might be enough to even the odds if they were smart about it. What's your answer going to be? Mabel whispered. Wyatt looked at the survey documents spread across their table, at the evidence of murder and corruption that could bring down an entire network of criminals if it ever reached the right authorities. Then he looked at the twins, awake now and huddled against their mother with the wide-eyed terror of children who understood that their world was about to change again. We're going to fight, he said quietly. Not just for the land, not just for our safety, but for James, for all the other families they've destroyed, for the truth. Outside, Blackwood's patience was clearly wearing thin. You have 1 minute to come out voluntarily. After that, we'll be forced to smoke you out. Wyatt moved to the window and called back. We're not going anywhere, Blackwood. And if you try to take us, the whole territory is going to know exactly what kind of man you really are. The silence that followed was pregnant with menace, broken only by the soft murmur of voices as the men outside discussed their options. Wyatt knew they were weighing the risks of violence against the potential benefits of simply eliminating all the witnesses to their crimes. When Blackwood spoke again, his voice had lost all pretense of civility. You've made your choice, Mr. Cole. I hope you can live with the consequences. I already am, Wyatt replied, and settled in to fight for the first family he'd had in years, the first home he'd found since leaving Missouri, and the first chance at happiness he'd allowed himself to believe in since his world had been turned upside down by other men's lives. The battle for their future was about to begin. The first torch came sailing through the darkness like a falling star, landing on this cabin's roof with a shower of sparks that made Wyatt's heart race. The dry wood, patched and weathered by countless seasons, caught fire immediately. "They're trying to burn us out," he said, moving away from the window. As more torches followed, the first Doc Mabel was already gathering the twins, speaking to them, in the calm, measured tone she probably used in her classroom when explaining difficult lessons. "Girls, we're going to play a game. A very important game where you have to do exactly what Mama and Mr. Cole tell you when we tell you, without any questions. Can you do that?" Both children nodded solemnly, their eyes reflecting the growing orange light from the flames above. Margaret clutched her wooden horses, while Mary held the bird Wyatt had carved for her, their small treasures providing comfort in a world that had suddenly become terrifying again. "The root cellar," Wyatt said, but Mabel shook her head. "It's too obvious. They'll check there first when they don't find our bodies in the ruins." She was moving with purpose now, grabbing items from around the cabin with the efficiency of someone who had thought through this scenario many times before. "There's another place James showed me. An old mine shaft about a quarter-mile north, hidden in a grove of cottonwoods." Wyatt could hear movement outside as the men positioned themselves around the burning cabin. They weren't taking chances. This was a coordinated operation designed to ensure that no one escaped to tell their story. "We'll never make it that far." "In the open," he said, checking the rifle's action one more time. "They've got the whole area surrounded." "Not the whole area," Mabel replied, pulling a blanket from their bed and wrapping the precious documents inside it. "James used to hunt deer along the creek bed. There's a dry wash that runs north from behind the cabin, deep enough to provide cover if we stay low." The heat from the roof fire was becoming noticeable now, and smoke was beginning to seep through. The ceiling boards. They had minutes, maybe less, before the cabin became uninhabitable. "What about them?" Wyatt gestured toward the men outside. "They'll come looking when they don't find us in the ashes. Let them look. By the time they realize we're gone, we'll be long gone ourselves." There was something in Mabel's voice, a note of grim determination that reminded Wyatt that this woman had already survived one murderous attack on her family. She wasn't just a victim, she was a survivor who had spent months planning for exactly this contingency. "Mama," Mary whispered, tugging on her mother's skirt, "are we going to die?" Mabel knelt down to meet her daughter's eyes, her hands gentle but firm on the child's shoulders. "No, sweetheart. We're going to live. We're going to get through this, and we're going to make sure that the bad men can't hurt anyone else the way they hurt Papa. Promise? I promise." It was a dangerous promise to make, Wyatt thought, given their circumstances. But he understood why she'd made it. Sometimes children needed absolute certainty, even when the adults providing it weren't certain of anything except their determination to fight. "Mr. Cole," Margaret said, looking up at him with eyes that seemed too old for her 6-year-old face. "Are you scared?" The question caught him off guard. Adults weren't supposed to admit fear to children, were they? But looking at this little girl who had already endured more loss and trauma than most people faced in a lifetime, Wyatt found himself choosing honesty over false comfort. "Yes," he said simply, "I'm scared. But being scared doesn't mean we can't be brave. Sometimes being brave means being scared and doing the right thing anyway." Margaret nodded as if this made perfect sense to her. Papa was scared when the bad men came before, but he was brave too. "Yes, he was. And we're going to be brave like your papa was." The smoke was getting thicker now, and Wyatt could hear the crackle of flames eating through the roof boards. Outside, Blackwood's voice carried over the sound of the fire as he directed his men to maintain their positions and watch for any attempt at escape. "Back window," Mabel said, moving toward the rear of the cabin, where a small window looked out over the area where the dry wash began. "It's our only chance." Wyatt positioned himself at the front window, rifle ready, while Mabel worked to open the back window as quietly as possible. The frame was warped and hadn't been opened in years, but finally it gave way with a soft groan. That was covered by the sounds of the fire. "I'll go first," Mabel said. "Then the girls, then you." No. I go first to make sure it's clear. Then the girls, then you. Wyatt, this isn't a discussion, Mabel. If something happens to me, you still have a chance to get them to safety. If something happens to you. He didn't finish the sentence, but they both knew what he meant. The twins needed their mother. More than they needed him. A board fell from the ceiling, trailing sparks and filling the cabin with even more smoke. They were out of time for debate. Wyatt handed Mabel the rifle and moved to the window. The drop wasn't far, but landing wrong could mean a twisted ankle or worse injuries they couldn't afford. He squeezed through the narrow opening and dropped as softly as he could manage, immediately scanning the area for threats. The men were still focused on the front and sides of the cabin, apparently confident that the back was adequately covered by the fire itself. In the flickering light of the flames, Wyatt could see the beginning of the wash Mabel had described, a natural depression in the earth that would provide concealment if they could reach it. He turned back to the window and held up his arms. Girls first. Mary came through the window with the fearless trust of childhood, dropping into his arms without hesitation. Margaret followed, clutching her wooden horses against her chest as if they were talismans that could protect her from harm. Mabel was more difficult. Her injured leg made climbing through the window awkward and painful, and Wyatt could see her struggling not to cry out as she maneuvered through the narrow space. When she finally dropped into his arms, he could feel her trembling, whether from pain, fear, or adrenaline, he couldn't tell. "The wash," she whispered, pointing toward the shadow-dark depression 20 yards away. They moved in single file, Wyatt leading with the twins between him and Mabel, all of them crouched low and moving as quietly as possible over the uneven ground. Behind them, the cabin was fully engulfed now, the flames reaching toward the night sky like grasping fingers. The wash was deeper than Wyatt had expected, carved by years of seasonal floods into a natural trench that would hide them from casual observation. The bottom was sandy and soft, muffling their footsteps as they made their way north toward the cottonwood grove Mabel had described. "How far?" he whispered. "Quarter mile, maybe a little more. The trees will hide the entrance to the mine." They had been walking for perhaps 10 minutes when they heard the shouts behind them. Someone had discovered that the cabin was empty, that their prey had somehow escaped the trap. "They'll backtrack," Wyatt said. "Figure out how we got out, follow our trail. Then we need to move faster." But even as she said it, Wyatt could see that Mabel was struggling. The uneven ground of the wash was difficult for someone with her mobility issues, and the pace they needed to maintain was more than she could sustain for long. "Margaret," he said quietly, "can you climb on my back?" The little girl nodded and clambered up without complaint, her arms wrapping around his neck while her wooden horses pressed against his spine. Mary took his hand, her small fingers gripping tightly as they continued their escape. The cottonwood grove appeared ahead of them, like a dark island in the prairie night. The trees were old and massive, their roots reaching deep into the water table that had drawn Jane Stover's attention in the first place. Among their shadows, Wyatt could just make out what looked like a vertical crack in the earth, the entrance to the abandoned mine that would serve as their refuge. "James used to say this mine was played out before we ever came to Kansas," Mabel explained as they approached the entrance. "Some old-timer worked it for a few years in the 60s, then gave up when the easy silver ran out." But James thought there was more. He thought the old-timer just didn't dig deep enough, or in the right direction. The mine entrance was narrow and dark, disappearing into the earth at an angle that suggested it had been carefully engineered rather than simply hacked out of the ground. Wooden support beams, weathered but still solid, framed the opening. "Is it safe?" Wyatt asked, thinking of cave-ins and bad air, and all the ways that underground spaces could become death traps. James checked it thoroughly. "The air is good, the supports are sound, and there's a chamber about 50 feet in where we can wait until morning." Behind them, they could hear the sounds of pursuit growing closer. Torches flickered in the distance as Blackwood's men spread, out to search for their trail. "All right," Wyatt said, lifting Margaret down from his back. "In we go." The mine was cool and dry, with the musty smell of earth and old timber. Mabel led the way with sure steps that suggested she'd been here before, while Wyatt brought up the rear, pausing at the entrance to listen for sounds of discovery. The chamber Mabel had mentioned was larger than he'd expected, with enough space for all of them to sit comfortably and even lie down if necessary. Someone, probably James, had left a few supplies here. Blankets, a jug of water, even some preserved food. How long do we wait? Wyatt asked as they settled into their underground refuge, until morning at least. Maybe longer, depending on how thoroughly they search. And then? Mabel pulled the wrapped documents from beneath her blanket and held them up. Then we take these to Topeka, to the federal marshal's office, to the territorial governor, to anyone who'll listen. We make sure that James's death and all the others weren't for nothing. Wyatt nodded, understanding that their escape was only the beginning of a larger battle. They had evidence of corruption and murder, but evidence was only useful if they could stay alive long enough to present it to the right authorities. There's something else, Mabel said quietly, glancing toward the twins who had curled up together on one of the old blankets. Something I haven't told you yet. What? The federal marshal in Topeka. His name is William Cole. Wyatt felt the words hit him like a physical blow. Cole? You think he's your brother? I don't know. A James met him once. Said he was about your age, from Missouri originally. Said he was the kind of lawman who couldn't be bought or intimidated. The possibility that his brother, the brother he hadn't seen in over a decade, might be their salvation seemed too good to be true. But it also felt like the kind of coincidence that wasn't really a coincidence at all. The kind of connection that made sense only when viewed as part of a larger pattern. If it is him, Wyatt said slowly, and if he's as honest as James thought, we might actually have a chance. We have a chance either way, Mabel replied firmly, because we have the truth and we have each other. And sometimes that's enough to change the world. Outside their underground sanctuary, they could hear the faint sounds of men searching the grove, their voices carrying on the night air as they looked for signs of their escaped quarry. But inside the mine, surrounded by the solid earth that had sheltered James Stover's secrets, Wyatt felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not just hope for survival, but hope for justice. Hope for a future where good people could build lives without fear of having them destroyed by the corrupt and powerful. Hope for a family that had been forged by circumstance, but was being strengthened by choice. Day by day, decision by decision. Tomorrow, they would emerge from this place and begin the journey that would either vindicate James Stover's sacrifice or add their names to the list of those who had died trying to expose the truth. But tonight, they were together, they were safe, and they had what they needed to fight back. And it was enough. Dawn came slowly to their underground refuge, announced not by sunlight, but by the gradual quieting of voices above as Blackwood's men finally abandoned their search. Wyatt had dozed fitfully through the night, starting awake at every sound, the rifle never far from his reach. Mabel had stayed awake entirely, her teacher's instincts keeping watch over her sleeping daughters, while her mind worked through the challenges that lay ahead. They're gone, she whispered as the last of the search party's voices faded into the distance. Wyatt nodded, but he knew their absence was temporary. Men like Blackwood didn't give up when there was this much at stake. They'd regroup, change tactics, maybe even bring in more help. The fact that their quarry had escaped would only make them more dangerous. We can't stay here, he said quietly, careful not to wake the twins. They'll be back with more men, maybe dogs to follow our scent. I know, but where can we go? They control the territorial government, the local law enforcement. Anyone we approach could be working for them. It was a sobering reality. In a frontier territory where official authority was often the only law that mattered, having that authority corrupted meant that normal channels of justice were close to them. Topeka, Wyatt said. Your husband was right. We need to go over their heads. Take this to federal authorities who aren't part of their network. That's 3 days hard travel, assuming we can find horses and supplies. With the girls. Mabel looked toward her sleeping daughters, and Wyatt could see the weight of impossible choices settling on her shoulders. We'll manage. We have to. Mary stirred on her blanket, her eyes opening with the instant alertness of a child who had learned to be wary of unexpected awakenings. "Are the bad men gone?" she whispered. "For now," Wyatt said, kneeling beside her. "But we need to move. We're going on a trip." "Where?" "To find someone who can help us make sure the bad men can't hurt anyone else." Margaret was awake now too, listening with the solemn attention she brought to adult conversations. "Are we going to see Uncle William?" The casual mention of the name made both adults freeze. "Uncle William?" Mabel asked carefully. "Papa used to talk about Uncle William sometimes. He said Uncle William was a marshal who helped people when bad things happened to them." Wyatt felt his heart racing. The coincidence of names was one thing, but for James to have spoken about a Marshal William as if he were family ... "Margaret, did your papa ever say Uncle William's last name?" The little girl screwed up her face in concentration. "Cole, I think. Uncle William Cole. Papa said maybe someday we could visit him in the big city." The confirmation hit Wyatt like a physical blow. His brother, the brother he'd left behind in Missouri when he'd headed west to seek his fortune, was not only alive, but working as a federal marshal in Kansas. The brother who'd been just 12 years old when Wyatt had left home, certain that he could make his fortune and send for his family once he was established. "What is it?" Mabel asked, seeing his expression. "William Cole is my brother," Wyatt said quietly. "I haven't seen him in over 10 years, but if James knew about him, if he was planning to make contact ... then your brother might already know something about what's been happening here," Mabel finished. "James might have been in communication with him before he died." It was a possibility that changed everything. If William was already investigating the corruption in the territorial government, if he had been working with James to gather evidence, then their arrival in Topeka might not be a desperate gamble, but the completion of a plan that had been set in motion months ago. "We need to get out of here," Wyatt said, his sense of urgency growing. "If Blackwood realizes who William is, if he figures out the connection, he'll try to get to your brother before we do," Mabel agreed. They gathered their few possessions quickly, Mabel wrapping the precious documents in oilcloth to protect them from the weather. The twins accepted the need for another sudden departure with the resilience of children who had learned that stability was a luxury they couldn't count on. The climb out of the mine was harder than the descent had been. Mabel's leg was stiff from sleeping on the hard ground, and the twins were cranky from hunger and the stress of their ordeal. But they emerged into the morning sunlight to find the cottonwood grove empty of threats, the searchers having moved on to other areas. "We need horses," Wyatt said, scanning the horizon for any sign of watchers, "and supplies for the journey." "Henderson's store in town might help us," Mabel suggested. "He's a decent man, and he's seen how we've been living. He might be willing to extend credit." "Too risky. Blackwood will have the town watched, maybe even threatened anyone who might help us. And we make our own way." It was Margaret who spotted the smoke first, a thin column rising from behind a hill, perhaps 2 miles to the east. "Look," she said, pointing. "Someone's cooking breakfast." Wyatt studied the smoke, trying to judge whether it represented opportunity or danger. A single column suggested a small camp, maybe travelers or a homesteader working a remote claim. But in their current situation, every human contact was a potential threat. "Could be friendly," Mabel said hopefully. "Could be a trap. Or it could be exactly what we need: decent people who might be willing to help." In the end, the decision was made for them by Mary's stomach, which chose that moment to growl loudly enough to be heard by everyone. The twins had eaten very little the night before, and the stress of their escape had burned through what energy they had. "All right," Wyatt said, "but we approach carefully. If anything feels wrong, we run." The walk across the prairie was tense, all of them staying low and using the natural contours of the land to avoid being seen from a distance. As they drew closer to the source of the smoke, they could make out a small camp beside a seasonal creek, a single wagon, 2 horses, and what appeared to be an elderly couple preparing their morning meal. "They look harmless enough," Mabel murmured. Looks can be deceiving. But as they watched from concealment, the couple's behavior suggested nothing more threatening than travelers making an early start on their journey. The man was tall and spare, with the careful movements of someone whose joints had been stiffened by years of hard work. The woman was smaller, gray-haired, moving around their camp with the efficient bustle of someone accustomed to cooking over an open fire. "I'm going to approach them," Wyatt decided. "You and the girls stay here unless I signal that it's safe. Be careful." Wyatt stood up from behind the ridge where they'd been hiding and walked openly toward the camp, his hands visible and empty. The old man noticed him first, straightening up from where he'd been tending the fire and reaching for something, probably a rifle that lay within easy reach. "Morning," Wyatt called out when he was still 20 yards away. "Don't mean to startle." "You folks." "Morning," the man replied cautiously. "You traveling alone?" "Not exactly. I've got a woman and 2 children with me. We've had some trouble, and we're hoping you might be able to spare some food for the little ones." The woman looked up at this, her maternal instincts apparently outweighing her husband's caution. "What kind of trouble?" "The kind that involves men with guns and torches," Wyatt said honestly. "We're not criminals, ma'am. Just people trying to do the right thing in a situation where that's turned out to be dangerous." The couple exchanged a look that spoke of years of marriage and shared decisions. Finally, the woman nodded. "Bring them over," she said. "Anyone traveling with children can't be all bad." Wyatt waved toward the ridge, and Mabel appeared with the twins, all of them moving with the careful gait of people who had spent an uncomfortable night on hard ground. The woman's expression softened further when she saw Mary and Margaret. "Lord, have mercy," she said, bustling toward them with a mother's concern. "When did these babies last have a proper meal?" "Yesterday," Mabel said gratefully. "We're much obliged for your kindness." "Nonsense. I'm Martha Henley, and this is my husband Samuel. We're heading east to visit our grandchildren in Missouri." "Mabel." "Stover," Mabel replied. "These are my daughters, Mary and Margaret. And this is Wyatt Cole." Samuel's eyes sharpened at the mention of Wyatt's name. "Cole? You wouldn't happen to be related to Marshal William Cole out of Topeka, would you?" "He's my brother," Wyatt said, feeling the familiar sensation of pieces falling into place. "Do you know him? Know him?" "Hell, boy, he saved my son's life too. Years ago. Bank robbers had taken him hostage, and Marshal Cole tracked them for 3 days through country that would have killed a lesser man. When he finally caught up with them, he talked them into surrendering without a shot being fired." Martha had already started filling plates with bacon and biscuits, pressing food into the twins' hands with the kind of maternal authority that brooked no argument. "Your brother's got a reputation throughout the territory," she said. "Honest as the day is long, and brave as they come." "He always was stubborn about doing what was right," Wyatt said, remembering the serious little boy who had followed him around their Missouri farm, asking endless questions about right and wrong, justice and fairness. "If you're heading to Topeka to see him, you'd better know that there's been talk," Samuel said seriously. "Word is that Marshal Cole has been asking uncomfortable questions about land deals and territorial appointments, making some important people nervous." "What kind of nervous?" Mabel asked, though Wyatt suspected they both already knew the answer. "The kind that gets federal marshals transferred to remote postings or worse. There's been pressure on him to back off, and when William Cole gets pressure, he tends to push back harder." It was exactly what Wyatt would have expected from his younger brother. The same stubborn streak that had gotten Wyatt into trouble was apparently serving William well in his chosen profession. "We need to reach him," Wyatt said. "As soon as possible." "Well, you won't make it on foot, not with children," Martha said practically. "Samuel, we've got that extra saddle horse." "Martha, don't Martha me. These people are in trouble, and they're trying to reach family. Besides, you heard what the man said about helping William's brother." Samuel sighed, but he was already moving toward their horses. "I suppose we can spare Buttercup. She's gentle enough for the children, and she knows the way to Topeka well enough." The mare he indicated was a sturdy bay with kind eyes and the patient demeanor of a horse accustomed to carrying precious cargo. Margaret immediately moved toward her, her fear temporarily forgotten in the presence of such a magnificent animal. "We can't pay you," Wyatt said honestly. "Not right now, anyway." Didn't ask you to, Samuel replied gruffly. Just promise me you'll get those children to safety and help your brother do whatever needs doing to clean up this mess. As they prepared to part ways, Martha pressed a bundle of food into Mabel's hands and whispered something that made the younger woman's eyes fill with tears. Whatever she said, it seemed to give Mabel strength, because when she turned back to Wyatt, her expression was determined rather than fearful. "Ready?" he asked. "Ready?" As they rode away from the kindness of strangers and toward an uncertain reunion with family, Wyatt reflected on the strange ways that fate wove people's lives together. Yesterday they had been running for their lives with no clear destination. Today they had a horse, supplies, and a specific person to find someone who might already be expecting them. But as they topped a ridge and saw dust clouds in the distance that suggested pursuit, Wyatt realized that their race to reach Topeka had become just that, a race against men who would do anything to prevent the truth from reaching the federal authorities. The final confrontation was coming, and everything they'd built together, their makeshift family, their fragile hope for justice, their dreams of a peaceful future hung in the balance. The dust clouds were gaining on them. Wyatt pushed Juniper harder than he liked, while Mabel rode behind him with Margaret, and Mary rode the gentle Mare Buttercup with the fearless confidence of childhood. They had covered perhaps 15 miles since leaving the Henleys' camp, but their pursuers were mounted on fresh horses and unencumbered by children or injured passengers. "There," Mabel called out, pointing toward a cluster of buildings visible in the distance. "Millfield. It's about halfway to Topeka." The small town looked like salvation, but Wyatt knew better than to count on sanctuary in a place where Blackwood's influence might reach. Still, it represented their best chance of finding help, or at least slowing down their pursuers long enough to get word to his brother. "How big is Millfield?" he asked as they approached the outskirts. "Maybe 100 people. There's a sheriff, but I don't know if he can be trusted." "We'll find out." The town was larger than Millbrook, but shared the same frontier architecture, weathered wood buildings lining a dusty main street, with the inevitable saloon, general store, and modest church that marked every growing community in Kansas. What caught Wyatt's attention immediately was the cluster of horses tied up outside the sheriff's office and the number of armed men lounging on the boardwalk nearby. "That's not good," Mabel murmured, following his gaze. "No, it's not." The men had the relaxed alertness of people waiting for something specific to happen. As Wyatt and his family rode down the main street, he could feel their attention focusing on them like heat from a magnifying glass. "Papa Wyatt," Mary said quietly, using the name she'd started calling him over the past few weeks. "Those men are watching us." "I know, sweetheart. Just keep riding." But before they could reach the far end of town, one of the men stepped into the street ahead of them, his hand resting casually on the butt of his gun. "Hold up there, folks. Sheriff wants a word with you." Wyatt reined in Juniper, his mind racing through options that all seemed to lead to the same conclusion. They were trapped. The men behind them had closed off their retreat, while more emerged from buildings along the street to form a loose but effective cordon. "What can we do for you?" Wyatt asked, keeping his voice level. "Just need to ask a few questions. You folks wouldn't happen to be the Cole family, would you?" The fact that they knew his name meant that word had traveled faster than their horses, which suggested telegraph communications between Blackwoods. People. They'd been expected here, probably at every town between Millbrook and Topeka. "I'm Wyatt Cole," he said. "This is my family. Sheriff Dawson wants to see you. All of you." There was no choice but to comply. They dismounted and were escorted into the sheriff's office, where a heavyset man with a badge and cold eyes waited behind a scarred wooden desk. Sheriff Dawson looked like the kind of lawman who had gotten his job through political connections rather than competence or integrity. "Mr. Cole," Dawson said without getting up, "you and your ... family have caused quite a stir. There are some serious charges being leveled against you." "What charges?" "Kidnapping, for starters. Taking a woman and children against their will. Then there's arson, burning down property that didn't belong to you. Assault on territorial officials. The list goes on." Wyatt felt anger building in his chest, but he forced himself to remain calm. Getting angry would only confirm whatever narrative Blackwood had already constructed. "Those charges are false, and you know it," Mabel said, stepping forward. "I went with Mr. Cole willingly. We're the ones who were attacked." "Ma'am, with all due respect, you're not exactly in a position to make rational decisions. Word is you've been under considerable stress since your husband's death. Might not be thinking clearly." The condescending tone made Mary step protectively. In front of her mother, her small chin raised defiantly. "Mama thinks just fine," she declared. "You're the one who's not thinking right." Dawson's expression darkened. "Little girl, you'd better learn some manners." "Don't talk to my daughter that way," Mabel said sharply. "Your daughter?" Dawson leaned back in his chair. "Funny thing about that. According to the territorial records, you don't have any legal claim to these children. Matter of fact, they're supposed to be in the custody of the territorial orphan system." It was a lie, but a clever one. In a territory where official records could be altered or destroyed at will, proving legal relationships became nearly impossible when the authorities chose not to recognize them. "Sheriff," Wyatt said, "I think you know exactly what's going on here. The question is whether you're going to be part of the solution or part of the problem." "Are you threatening me, Mr. Cole? I'm giving you a chance to do the right thing." Dawson stood up, his hand moving to his gun. "The right thing is to hold you until the territorial authorities can sort this mess out. You'll be staying in our jail." He never finished the sentence. The door to the sheriff's office burst open, and a man stepped through who made everyone in the room freeze. He was tall and lean, with dark hair and eyes that Wyatt recognized, despite 10 years of separation and the authority of a federal marshal's badge. "Sheriff Dawson," William Cole said quietly, "I believe you have some people here who belong to me." The resemblance between the brothers was unmistakable, though William had filled out from the skinny boy Wyatt remembered. His face had the weathered look of a man who spent his life outdoors, but his eyes held the same unwavering sense of justice that had driven him even as a child. "Marshal Cole," Dawson said, clearly flustered, "this is a territorial matter. You don't have jurisdiction." "I have jurisdiction wherever federal crimes have been committed," William interrupted. "And kidnapping, murder, conspiracy to defraud the government, those are federal crimes, Sheriff." "I don't know what you're talking about." William's smile was cold. "Then you won't mind if I take a look at that warrant you're holding my brother on." "Your brother?" "Wyatt Cole is my brother, and unless you have a valid federal warrant for his arrest, you have no authority to hold him." Dawson looked like a man who had suddenly found himself in water much deeper than he'd expected. His eyes darted toward the door, where more men were visible, but these wore the badges of federal deputies rather than local guns for hire. "Now," William continued, "we can do this the easy way, where you admit you've been acting on the orders of corrupt territorial officials and agree to cooperate with our investigation. Or we can do it the hard way, where I arrest you as an accessory to murder and let a federal judge sort out your level of involvement." "Murder?" Dawson's voice cracked slightly. "James Stover was beaten to death by men working for Harrison Blackwood. We have witnesses, we have evidence, and we have enough proof to bring down everyone involved in this conspiracy." Wyatt felt a surge of relief, so strong it nearly buckled his knees. His brother wasn't just aware of the situation, he was actively investigating it, had been building a case against Blackwood's network. Their desperate flight to Topeka hadn't been necessary after all. Justice was already coming to them. "William," he said quietly, and his brother turned to look at him for the first time since entering the office. "Hello, Wyatt," William said, and despite the official nature of their surroundings, Wyatt could see genuine warmth in his younger brother's eyes. "Took you long enough to find me." "I didn't know you were looking to be found." "I've been looking for you for 2 years, ever since I heard about the cattle theft charges in Dodge City. Took me a while to figure out that someone was deliberately destroying your reputation to keep you from testifying about what you'd seen." The twins had been watching this exchange with wide-eyed fascination, clearly trying to understand the relationship between the two men who looked so much alike. Margaret tugged on Mabel's skirt. "Mama," she whispered loudly, "is that really Uncle William?" William's attention turned to the little girls, and his expression softened. "You must be Mary and Margaret. Your papa wrote to me about you." "Papa wrote to you?" Mary asked. "He did. He was very proud of you both. And he was working with me to make sure that the men who hurt your family would be brought to justice." Dawson had been growing more agitated as the conversation continued, clearly, realizing that his position was becoming untenable. "Now look here, Marshal," he blustered. "I was just following orders. Blackwood said these people were dangerous, that they'd stolen territorial property." "Sheriff Dawson," William said formally, "you're under arrest for conspiracy, kidnapping, and obstruction of justice. You have the right to remain silent." As his brother recited the charges and his deputies moved to take Dawson into custody, Wyatt felt the weight of months of fear and uncertainty lifting from his shoulders. They'd done it. They'd survived long enough for the truth to catch up with. The lies for justice to arrive in the form of an honest lawman who happened to be family. But even as relief flooded through him, Wyatt knew their troubles weren't over. Blackwood was still out there, still dangerous, and men like him didn't surrender easily when their empires were threatened. "William," he said, "Blackwood knows we're here. He'll be coming with everything he's got." His brother nodded grimly. "I'm counting on it. It's time to end this, once and for all." Outside, they could hear the sound of many horses approaching at speed. The final confrontation was about to begin, but this time they wouldn't be facing it alone. This time they had the law on their side, real law, honest law, the kind that actually meant something. As William deployed his deputies and prepared for what was coming, Wyatt gathered Mabel and the twins close to him. Whatever happened next, they would face it together, as a family forged by adversity and strengthened by love. The sound of gunfire echoed through the streets of Millfield as two versions of law and order prepared to settle their differences the only way that seemed possible on the frontier, with violence, truth, and the hope that when the smoke cleared, justice would be the only thing left standing. 6 months later, Wyatt stood on the front porch of their rebuilt home, watching his daughters, for that's how he thought of them now, officially and in his heart, chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. The old cabin was gone, burned to ash that terrible night, but the new house was better in every way that mattered. Larger, sturdier, with real glass windows and a stone foundation that would last for generations. The silver mine that James Stover had discovered was producing steadily now, providing more than enough income to support their family and fund the school that Mabel had established in the growing community around their homestead. The federal investigation that William had led had exposed corruption throughout the territorial government, sending Blackwood and his associates to federal prison and opening the way for honest development of the region. "Papa Wyatt," Mary called, out, holding up a mason jar that glowed with the soft light of captured fireflies. "Look how many we caught." "Beautiful," he called back, though he was looking at her and Margaret rather than the insects. The twins had grown in the past months, not just taller, but stronger, more confident, their laughter coming easier and there. Nightmares becoming rare. The screen door opened behind him, and Mabel emerged carrying 2 cups of coffee and the family Bible they'd received as a wedding gift from the congregation of the small church they attended in town. She moved more easily now, the constant pain in her leg managed by better medicine, and the security of knowing their future was stable. "The girls will need baths before bed," she said, settling beside him on the porch swing he'd built from plans in one of her teaching magazines. "I know. I'll heat the water after they've tired themselves out." She smiled at his acceptance of domestic responsibilities that would have seemed foreign to him a year ago. Marriage had changed him in ways he was still discovering, softening some edges while strengthening others. "William's coming for dinner Sunday," she said, opening the Bible to where she'd been reading earlier. "He wants to talk to you about something." "Work?" He didn't say, but I suspect it's personal rather than professional. Wyatt's brother had been a frequent visitor since their wedding, building a relationship with his nieces and forming a friendship with Mabel that warmed Wyatt's heart. William had never married his work as a federal marshal made personal relationships difficult, but he'd found a kind of family connection with them that seemed to fulfill something important in his life. Margaret's been asking about her papa. Again, Mabel said quietly. About James, I mean. She wants to know if it's all right to love you both. It was a delicate subject, one they'd navigated carefully as their family had evolved from necessity to choice. James Stover would always be the twins' biological father, the man who had loved them first and died protecting their future. Wyatt didn't want to replace that memory, only to add to it. What did you tell her? That love isn't something that gets used up. That hearts can be big enough to hold more than one person, and that her Papa James would be happy knowing she had another papa to take care of her. And she accepted that? She asked if that meant she could have more than one mama too, if something happened to me. The question was so typical of Margaret's practical nature that Wyatt smiled despite the serious subject matter. What did you say? That we pray nothing will happen to me. But yes, hearts are big enough for all kinds of love. Through the gathering. Darkness. They could see lights beginning to appear in the windows of other homes, scattered across what had once been empty prairie. The community that was growing around the mine was attracting good families, people drawn by the promise of honest work and the reputation for fairness that had developed since Blackwood's network had been dismantled. Do you ever regret it? Mabel asked suddenly. Giving up your wandering life for all this domesticity? Wyatt considered the question seriously. A year ago, he'd been a drifter with no ties, no responsibilities beyond his own survival. Now he was a husband, a father, a pillar of a growing community with obligations and expectations that would have terrified his younger self. No, he said finally. I thought I wanted freedom, but what I really wanted was purpose. Family gives you purpose. Even when that family comes with complications? Injured wives, traumatized children, dead husbands whose shadows still linger? Especially. Then, he reached over to take her hand, noting the way her wedding ring caught the last light of day. She'd moved James's ring from the chain around her neck to a small jewelry box on her dresser, not forgotten, but no longer carried as a weight against her heart. Perfect families don't need you the way complicated ones do. The twins were coming. Up the porch steps now, grass stains on their dresses and joy in their faces. Mary carried her jar of fireflies, while Margaret clutched the wooden horse that Wyatt had carved for her, now joined by an entire herd of animals he'd created during quiet evenings by the fire. Can we read a story before bed? Mary asked, settling. Beside her mother on the swing. Of course. What story would you like? The one about the cowboy who saved the family at the auction, Margaret said, squeezing onto the swing between Wyatt and Mabel. That's not a story, sweetheart. That really happened. I know, but it's a good story anyway. Mabel opened the Bible. But instead of reading from Scripture, she began to tell the tale that had become family legend, how a poor cowboy with 40 silver dollars and a good heart had changed 4 lives with a single act of compassion. How that act had grown into something larger, a fight for justice that had made their corner of Kansas a better place for everyone. As she spoke, Wyatt reflected on the strange paths that had brought them together. The auction that had seemed like an ending had actually been a beginning. The threats and violence that had tested their resolve had only made them stronger. The love that had grown between them, all of them, had proved more durable than the hatred of their enemies. And they all lived happily ever after. Mary prompted, as Mabel reached the end of the tale. They lived, Mabel corrected gently. Some days were happy, some were hard, but they faced them all together. And that was enough. Later, after the twins had been bathed and tucked into their beds, after Mabel had finished her evening correspondence with the Territorial Education Department about expanding their school, Wyatt found himself back on the porch alone, looking up at stars that seemed brighter here than they had during his years of wandering. A sound from inside made him turn. Mabel practicing piano on the instrument he'd bought for her birthday, her fingers finding melodies that spoke of contentment rather than sorrow. The music drifted through the night air like a promise, a reminder that some dreams really did come true. If you were willing to fight for them, tomorrow would bring new challenges. The mine required constant attention. The school was expanding, faster than they could find qualified teachers, and William's investigation had uncovered evidence of corruption in other territories that would require testimony and travel. But tonight, his family was safe, His home was peaceful, and his heart was full. As he prepared to go inside, Wyatt heard the sound of another wagon approaching their property. Late visitors were unusual, but not unheard of. Word of their story had spread throughout the territory, and they occasionally received travelers seeking similar refuge or assistance. The wagon that emerged from the darkness carried a man and woman with 3 children, their possessions bundled in the back with the desperate efficiency of people who had left somewhere in a hurry. The man climbed down slowly, clearly exhausted, while the woman held an infant and tried to comfort 2 older children who were crying softly. "Evening," the man called out. "Name's Peterson. We heard. That is, someone told us you might be able to help folks who've had their land stolen." Wyatt smiled, remembering another night when desperate people had appeared seeking help, when Mary had asked if they were going to die, and Mabel had promised they would live. The cycle was continuing, justice creating space for more justice, kindness opening doors for more kindness. "You heard right," he said, stepping down from the porch. "Come on up to the house. We'll get you fed and bedded down for the night, and tomorrow we'll figure out how to help you get your land back." As he helped the family gather their belongings, Wyatt caught sight of Mabel watching from the window, her expression understanding and supportive. She knew, as he did, that their comfortable life was built on a foundation of helping others, that their happiness was meaningful only when it was shared. The Peterson children reminded him of his own daughter's frightened but resilient, clinging to hope despite having every reason to despair. Tomorrow he would introduce them to Mary and Margaret, who would probably share their toys and their confidence that good people could overcome bad circumstances if they worked together. By the time the new family was settled in the spare room they kept ready for such occasions, the night was well advanced. Wyatt and Mabel lay in their bed, listening to the sounds of children sleeping safely under their roof, of adults finally able to rest without fear. "You realize this means we'll be involved in another fight," Mabel said quietly. "If the Petersons' story is true, if someone really did steal their homestead illegally." "I know. And you're all right with that? With never quite being able to live a completely peaceful life?" Wyatt thought about it, about the choice between safety and justice, between comfort and purpose. A year ago, he would have chosen safety, without hesitation. Now, surrounded by the family he'd built and the community he'd helped protect, the answer came easily. "As long as we face it together," he said, "I'm all right with whatever comes." Outside their window, the night air carried the sound of wind through the cottonwoods, the distant call of night birds, and the sense of a world where justice was possible and families could be built from love rather than just blood. It was a good sound, a sound of home. And in the morning, they would wake up ready to fight for it all over again.